Hi everyone, my name is Ciara, and I'm presenting on the topic of witch hunt records from two German cities in modern-day Bavaria, Bamberg and Würzburg, in the early part of the 17th century. Witch trials were a common spectacle in early modern towns and cities at this time, and they were particularly brutal in these two areas. How do we know this? Well, there are some written records that describe the legal procedure of witch prosecution, as well as images and descriptions of witches and witch trials in the early modern print media. In terms of the background to this research, this presentation is based off of research I conducted for my final year dissertation submitted this year. My thesis was supervised by Dr. Richard Kerwin, who lectures in the Department of History here in UL. He's been a huge help throughout my research and, as an early modern Germany specialist, provided me with some very useful advice for analysing documents that I'll be discussing in a few moments. This topic incorporated both of my degree subjects in that I spent a great deal of time translating materials printed in early New High German, and in my opinion, this is probably a factor why they have not been researched up to now. I was lucky enough to have the chance to visit Bamberg and Würzburg a couple of years ago, and I had the chance to visit the witch hunt memorials, which led me to investigate them further and thus resulted in this thesis. Here, I'll just have a quick rundown on the points of note that I want to mention in the next couple of minutes. I will discuss the legalities of witch trials with an example from Bamberg. I will look at the Hickzeitung or witch newspapers that were part and parcel of popular print media at the time. And by the end of this presentation, I hope to make a case for further investigation of these more subjective source types in the broader context of witchcraft studies and highlight how useful these records can be in helping us understand the society and its attitudes at the time. Witchcraft was considered a crime in the Holy Roman Empire, and the Carolingian Law Code, ratified by Emperor Charles V in 1532, classified it as a capital crime punishable by death by burning. With the Reformation came an enormous zeal for combating heresy, particularly prevalent in Catholic areas, and this by going against the Christian faith, as witchcraft was believed to involve making a pact with the devil, it fell under this category. This was expressed through a surge in prosecutions of witchcraft, which was especially prevalent in the German lands, and estimates of the number of trials range from 15 to 50,000 across the scholarship. And here in these figures for Rothenburg ob der Tauber, Bamberg and Würzburg, you can get an idea of the wide-ranging patterns of executions. It's also interesting to note that of these figures cited for Bamberg and Würzburg, they are just recorded in the year 1616 to 1617, and a much more brutal wave of persecutions occurred in the later 1620s that would far outpace this level of executions. It's important to note, however, that due to the destruction of archives down through the years, the existing records that we have are inconsistent, and sometimes there is a tendency by scholars to inflate figures in order to assign more importance to their studies, so it can be quite difficult to provide definitive figures on this area. In order to consider the judicial process, I'll move on to look at the specifics of a case relating to the mayor of Bamberg, Johannes Unis, in 1628. He was Burgomaster at this time, and his interrogation and a letter he wrote to his daughter were preserved, making his trial one of the most complete on historical record. He was well respected in the community and was elected mayor on 5 occasions before his trial. Because of this, some scholars would argue that his trial was not politically motivated, as was the case with many others in this area at the time, as he did not court controversy in his work for the council. However, it is worth pointing out that all possessions of a witch upon their execution were bequeathed to the Prince Bishop, who was the ruler of the city. Given Unis's social status and employment, it was likely that a significant amount of wealth would be contributed to the bishop's treasury upon his death. In terms of the trial itself, it took place in an inquisitorial style with 2 confrontations, where witnesses gave evidence that Unis was seen at a witches' dance and desecrated the Eucharist. Others named as his co-conspirators had confessed their guilt, so he was given time to reconsider his plea and the case was adjourned until June. He continued to plead his innocence, and while imprisoned in the specially built witch prison pictured here known as the Drudenhaus, he was tortured with thumbscrews and leg screws until he eventually caved and confessed his guilt and was later executed that August. In his letter to Veronica, he makes a point that nobody is exempt from the accusations of witchcraft. The common stereotype most people think of are of old, disfigured women that were isolated from the society. But the reality is that men, women, and even children of all social ranks, as was the case in Würzburg, could also be accused by their neighbours. Sometimes those accused would name other people as witches in their own trials, which perpetuated a brutal cycle of persecutions. Stories like that of Unis were known not only by the judiciary and the people that took part in the trials, they were also circulated among the cities and towns of the empire through pamphlets and broadsheets known as Hickzeitung or witch newspapers. These two types were subtly different as described here, but they regularly featured gruesome tales and illustrations in order to gain a larger readership. As they were fairly inexpensive even to the most lowly paid day labourers, they were accessible to all levels of society, and those that were illiterate could access their contents through discussion among the community or even through popular lyrics set to music of the day. This was in sharp contrast to the lengthy theoretical books written by demonologists such as Heinrich Kramer and Martin del Rio, which were written in Latin and mostly catered to the wealthier elites. Hexenzeitungen are often overlooked in witchcraft studies due to their sensationalist nature, but they do provide an insight into the perceptions of people at the time and how they influenced the popular understanding of witchcraft. Because of their accessibility, news of witch trials spread from the publishing towns to the surrounding towns, and on one occasion a newsletter discussing Bamberg and Würzburg was censored by the Nuremberg Council in case their contents would incite paranoia among the community and lead to public unrest. There are certainly a number of factors worth considering when it comes to working with documents like letters and Hexenzeitungen. Both are highly subjective and they're not concerned with maintaining factual accounts. This is a dilemma that historians grapple with when looking at such sources, because on one hand it is important to use reliable sources that are verifiable and correspond with the evidence that is already in existence. On the other hand, including cultural sources like popular print media and personal letters in research means that you have to bear in mind the people within the society and the attitudes, ideas, and opinions that shape them. Human experience is what supports all historical research, and it is crucial to balance the responsibility of staying true to the established facts while also remaining aware of the variety of interpretations that can affect how we understand this information. So what are the limitations of the research outlined in this presentation? Well, print media and legal records are not extensively researched because there are very few documents that remain in their entirety in the libraries and archives of Europe. These particular source types are often disregarded in that there are very few specialists within the wider academic community engaged with the cultural aspects of witchcraft studies. Wolfgang Behringer focuses enormously on trial procedures and has done some significant research in terms of primary source accounts, while Abigail Warfield is the only scholar that has catalogued the existing Hexenzeitungen and assessed their usefulness for researching witchcraft. And nobody has drawn the connection between these types of sources. My final point here sums up the argument for this presentation. In my opinion, there's a strong relationship between trial records and witch newsletters, and that they influence and affect each other in terms of their ideas and beliefs, and are in turn influenced and affected by the social and political circumstances of the community. This relationship is critical to understanding public perceptions of witchcraft, and what people in areas like Bamberg and Würzburg thought and believed about it. Sometimes historians focus so much on finding the truth about the past that we can often forget that what was believed to be true is often just as important in researching history. And when it comes to witchcraft, these beliefs are what drove such huge numbers of trials and executions in early modern Europe as a whole. Last but by no means least, here is my selected bibliography. It is by no means exhaustive, but it includes a few of the most important resources that contributed to the research discussed here in this presentation. So thank you very much to everyone who was involved in organising the conference this year. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this presentation provided an insight into the value of legal records in print media and witchcraft studies and in cultural history as a whole.